Oh, thank you. Thank you, Bioneers. Thank you so much. That was quite an introduction. So also thank you, JP, for that. It's truly an honor to be here. I am Rae Wynn Grant. I am a wildlife ecologist. I am an active research scientist. And I usually attend conferences where I'm doing research talks, where you kind of give your whole life for 25 minutes, and then people ask you really tough questions about your statistical methods and try to find holes in everything that you did. So it is with so much gratitude that I grace this stage, which is a friendly audience, an informed audience, a caring audience, a pretty jazzed up audience. I saw the dancers during the drum circle. That was really cool. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some very personal stories. And I'm going to share my personal stories in the spirit of our collective understanding that we all have our own journeys and our own experiences that have informed how we show up to our collective environmental movements, whether it's wildlife conservation, healing, land return, different types of environmental justice, or whatever we're particularly focused on. And I'm going to offer a couple of the ways that my journey through mainstream Western science both educated me and in a lot of ways miseducated me, and how I was able to come back to myself and come back to some really deep learnings that have guided me forward. But I am an active researcher. I study large carnivores. I focus on the movement and the behavior of large carnivores like bears, black and grizzly bears, African lions, and occasionally primates in Central Africa. And I am fortunate to do high-level statistical analyses that tell me information about the whole population of these animals, but every so often I'm able to really get to know an individual and get very hands-on with an individual, particularly female animals is what I spend a lot of my time on, looking at females of reproductive age and how healthy they are. It's usually full of a lot of good news, and so I'm one of those scientists that gets to really explore the wildlife community and learn how strong these animals are and how resilient they are in many ways. And like my intro was saying, I also do a lot of science communication. I can't help it. I like to talk. I like to present. I like to shout about nature from wherever I can be. And I've recently put a lot of my stories into a book. And I also spend my time working on Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, one of America's most iconic nature shows that I'm truly honored to play a role in. But before I was Miss Wilderness, I was a little urban kid, and I had an extremely urban upbringing, which I think is a good thing. I'm very proud of that. But I grew up with parents who lived in the big city. We went on trips to other big cities, and my whole world was urban. And I like to use this photo of me in the late 80s, because it really shows how I did access nature in the outdoors, and it was making mud pies in the alleyway on the side of my house in the inner city. And that was enough for me. I loved it, right? I saw, the occasional pigeon and squirrel, maybe a couple earthworms, and that was great. Ironically, the place where I really became super passionate about nature was indoors. It was by watching TV. It was sitting on the floor of my grandparents' living room here in the Bay Area and watching nature shows. And they took me to Africa and Australia, Asia, South America, kind of everywhere but, the United States, and showed me these incredible landscapes and these creatures that needed protection. And when I was a little kid, I said, I want to be a nature show host. I want to do what these British and Australian guys are doing. And my family was very supportive. They're kind of like, oh, I guess it could be worse. That's fine. Never heard of it, but that's fine. And I took that desire all the way through college. And I have this distinct memory, I write about it in my memoir, of entering college. And going to my advisor's office in the first week of my freshman year and saying, I want to be a nature show host. What do I have to major in to do that? And my advisor was stumped and said, I don't know, maybe theater? Journalism, maybe? And then finally arrived at environmental science. What about environmental science? And I said, never heard of it, but sounds good. And I dove into environmental science, which was the exact right place for me to land. And I found, for the first time, as a freshman in college, that those nature shows that I was watching as a kid and as a teenager were introducing me to science. They never said it explicitly. They never said, this is a biology show. But I learned that, hey, there's a science behind what these people are showing me. There's a science behind wildlife conservation. And I may never, at the time, I thought, I may never host a nature show. But at least I can do that work without the cameras. I can be a part of those communities of people who are developing the science that can be used to make solutions for nature. And that was a fit for me. Until a couple years into it, I thought to myself, what's missing, though, is that I've never been outside. There's something about reading about forests and savannas in a textbook and seeing animals on a PowerPoint that just doesn't quite hit. And I realized this, and so at 20 years old, I got outside, and I signed myself up for a study abroad program. I, again, went back to that same advisor in college and said, I need the most hardcore wildlife ecology study abroad program you can find, and they did. And I landed in southern Kenya and lived in a community of students and folks from the nearest Maasai village outside of Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya for a semester-long wildlife management and ecology study abroad program. And this is a picture of me on my 20th birthday, and I had just taken my first hike, pitched my first tent, saw my first wild animal, which, by the way, was not like an elephant or a giraffe or something. It was a marabou stork. And so if you don't know what a marabou stork is, look it up. They're 5 feet tall. They look like velociraptors from a distance. They're super, super cool. And I dove right in to studying wildlife. So I'm no photographer. I took this with a disposable film camera in 2005 when I was there in Kenya. But I felt like I was doing it. I was doing that nature show stuff that I always wanted to do. And I was being trained to do it in a vacuum, right? To look at the needs of wildlife and the needs of wildlife only. Now, this was 2005 in southern Kenya. The world had the internet, Kenya had the internet, but not in the bush where we were living. There were no cell phones, there was no internet, we barely had electricity. And so to correspond with my family back home, we had to write letters. And the letters took about a month to get to them, and then it took about a month for them to send me something. So mail was sparse. But the very first package that I got from my parents had letters and postcards and some CDs that they sent me. And it also had this edition of Time magazine, because while I had been away, Hurricane Katrina had occurred in the United States, in the Gulf of Mexico, in Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi. And almost 1,000 people perished in that tragedy, and it was a highly racialized event, right? People who were evacuated didn't necessarily look like the people who weren't evacuated. The people who died didn't reflect the people who lived. And there I was, just enveloped in this passion for wildlife ecology, reading this article and crying around the campfire. And folks from the Maasai community that also served as the staff for the program came over to comfort me and to ask me questions. And I described what I was reading in Time magazine without any other context, without conversations or the news on or anything. And they said to me, "So why are you here? You're all the way across oceans and continents studying our wildlife, but it looks like your people and your community at home really need some help." And it was at that moment that I realized that I couldn't shake that passion for wildlife ecology. There's nothing I could do. I was in it. I got that spark. But that I would never, because of my identity, I would never be able to solely do this science work in that vacuum as I had been taught. My personal identity as a Black American millennial woman would mean that I would always be concerned for social justice at the same time, if not more, than the work that I was doing with wild animals. And I needed a way for that to be okay, and for that to be a part of who I was and my work. There was a huge struggle for me, which took me on a journey, but I was hooked in science, and I remained in academia and kind of went through that path. I had opportunities to study. This image, I am holding a bear collar, a GPS tracking collar for a bear, and I'm here in the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from where we are now. I went around the world studying wild animals, mostly through academia, and mostly through this ecological lens. But I found that I was always bringing myself, my personal identity, and the needs of my community with me. So my first story is from 2005, but why don't we fast forward to 2014? I had been studying large carnivores for over a decade, and I found myself at the end of my Ph.D. program, which was in ecology and evolutionary biology at Columbia University. I was living in New York City, but flying out to the western US to study black bears. And my focus was on being able to describe the mortality risk of black bears from a landscape perspective. So essentially being able to make maps that show where black bears are most in danger of being killed by humans and how we can change those danger zones. And I'd been doing pretty well, and I got to this place where I was invited to speak at the biggest ecology conference that we have in the scientific community. And I was living in New York, but the conference was in Sacramento in 2014, and so I flew across the country to San Francisco, visited my grandparents who lived out here, hopped in the car to drive to Sacramento, and I was nervous. I was like really, really nervous. And so when I get nervous before a conference or presentation, I turn on what I call smart people radio, which at the time meant NPR. I still love NPR. So I turn on NPR to just get my mind in that zone, right? And there was news. And there was news that a young black man named Michael Brown had just been shot and murdered by police in Ferguson, Missouri. And the people of Ferguson were outraged and they were protesting. Some media outlets would say they were rioting. And Ferguson was literally on fire. And this wasn't new, right? This was another example of police brutality to black communities that was getting more media attention before because we have smartphones that can record it these days and body cams that can record it instead of in years past. And I found myself driving to the conference. I made the mistake of driving the day I was presenting. And I realized I was about to go in front of thousands of people, of ecologists, and talk about the mortality risk of black bears in America. And all I could think of was the mortality risk of black men in America at the same time. Oh, I was destroyed. And I had this prop that you see in the picture for the conference. I thought, let me jazz up my ecology talk a little bit with a prop, and it's a bear skull. And in the picture, I'm pointing to a bullet hole in the bear skull, where it was shot and killed by an intolerant and hostile person. And I brought it up there, and I bravely said, I'm here to talk about how this bear died. This is a bullet hole to its brain. But I'm so afraid that nobody cares about how Michael Brown died the day before with a bullet to his body. And these conversations need to be a part of the ecology community and the scientific community. And let me just say, I have an articulation for this now, but at the time I was a complete mess, so it wasn't nearly as articulate. But my main point was that we care so much about science, and the people I was with supported science. I mean, there is no question. But did they support scientists? And I went on stage to say, if we will do anything for science, we have to offer that energy and that passion for scientists also. Scientists who are women, who are non-binary people, who are Black and brown and immigrants and Muslim and from the LGBTQ plus community and any kind of oppressed group. Those are scientists. And when a scientist comes from a community that is on fire, facing oppression or violence or famine or genocide or anything like that, that scientist can't focus on their science. And when their science is in service to the planet, is helping to create a healthy, thriving ecosystem, then we all lose. And I realized in this moment, and I called on my fellow ecologists to say, we have to have social justice at a minimum as a foundation for environmental solutions. Otherwise, we only have the most privileged people working on these solutions. And it's too slow. I was able to say that from a safe place. The cops weren't after me. You know, I realized that I always hold so much privilege to be able to make these confessions and announcements and epiphanies, but not everyone has that. There are so many people who don't know they're ecologists because they're dealing with the hardest things in life. And it is our duty to alleviate a lot of that so that we can all work together. Now, I learned these lessons, and then I've learned some other lessons. And so I'm going to show you a quick image of a really cute little baby bear, but I have a sad story to tell. So during some of my work in the Lake Tahoe Basin, not far from here, studying bears, one day, and I write about this in my book, one day I got a call that a hiker had discovered a dead bear. And that wasn't usually the case, right? The bear population, if you know anything about Tahoe, they're abundant. They're doing pretty good. The population is strong. And so my colleague and I went to investigate, and we found a young black bear dead in a small stream, in a very shallow stream, about maybe 4 inches of water, so it couldn't have drowned. And we pulled it out, and we looked for signs of being shot. We couldn't find a bullet entrance wound, and we couldn't find anything that appeared wrong with it. My colleague said, okay, in moments like this, we actually do a field necropsy, so we will open up the animal, and the first place we should explore is its stomach to see if maybe it ingested something that had killed it. I'll spare you the details, but if you want to read about it, I give you all the gory details in the book. But we opened the stomach of this young black bear in Tahoe in the middle of the forest, birds chirping, sun shining, and it was full. The stomach was full. And as we opened it, the contents of the stomach spilled out, and it was full of ketchup packets from the local fast food dumpster. And that young animal must have wandered from the forest to the dumpster that was open, devoured a lot of goodies and those kind of small aluminum ketchup packets, and crawled its way to the nearest stream to get some water to try to save its own life, and didn't. And man, that was a tough day, because one individual suffering meant that the population wasn't doing as great as we thought. And it was the inverse of those lessons that I learned about people and how the suffering of one individual can symbolize a huge problem. It's the same in the wildlife community. And essentially, this is not new, right? There have been many incredible scholars and thinkers who've articulated these ideas way better than me in the past, and Audre Lorde is one of my favorites. But we do not lead single-issue lives, so we cannot look at a single-issue struggle. It's not save the whales, right? It's, as Grandma Casey said before me, it's we are nature and we are saving ourselves. And it's okay if that focus is on people and communities and social justice. It's okay if that focus is on wild animals, but it needs to be comprehensive and radical. And that's what I'm here to explore more with you all today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.